Okay.
I think that made an impact, right? If I can invite everybody to please come back in so we continue this morning session. This session the title of our session is Feminist Perspectives on Sustainable Peace, and it really follows quite logically from the previous section that we just had on women's agency and participation in humanitarian spaces. I think the main difference between that earlier session and that, there's several differences, but one of the main differences is that I think the earlier session focused much more on the immediate environment of armed conflict and immediate post-war environment of armed conflict. What we're going to try to do in this session is to think more long-term, to think about what we actually mean by sustainable peace, what we mean by peace. Right now we have added this idea of sustainable and what that actually consists of. I have the privilege of having here on the panel people who are actually from countries that are at various stages of conflict. Right? So we have Hajar here from Libya, who is, which is presumably a country that is still right in the middle, right? Or there has been no real settlement there. Then we have Rosa from Colombia, and they just had are starting really the building of sustainable peace right now that the conflict maybe has been settled. And then we have Nela here from Bosnia. And Bosnia supposedly has settled matters a long time ago, but certainly the building of sustainable peace is very much an ongoing process. We are going to go in two rounds. People are going to speak very briefly on two questions. One question is going to focus on participation, because we do think that participation is something that strings from the immediate conflict environment and the settlement negotiations into a longer term. It has longer term effects. So we're picking up on some of the things that were already said in the earlier panel. And then we're going to ask ourselves what exactly makes peace sustainable, and why is it important for women to be involved in that, and how they have to be involved in it. And I'm going to push a little bit more towards being academic, which is in part my own location. I should have introduced myself also. I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute, which is an institution here in Geneva, and I'm very happy and lucky that Carol Cohn also has been able to join us on this panel, because she's another academic. So I'm going to have her do academic stuff and pull us maybe also sometimes a little bit away from the concrete environments and try to think a little more conceptually and see whether those concepts make sense and how they make sense and what they allow us to ask as we are looking at these concrete situations. I would like to start with Hajar, actually. Right? And Hajar, I would like to ask you to continue on something we heard you here yesterday already about the WILPF project, the consultation with Libyan women, and which sought to understand what their understanding is of peace and security, right? And you showed that, first of all, something also that was shown in the earlier panel, that women are political. Right? It's not like they don't have any opinions, and in a sense, in the same way in which women are humanitarians, as we heard earlier, women are actually already also politicians. But how can you amplify then these voices that are there? You talked about an online mechanism, and I would like you to expand on that a little bit more. First of all, maybe giving us a sense of what these women actually said, right? And then also how this online mechanism and information technology, what what's the potential and also what are the shortcomings on that. And I should say 5 minutes, and I'm going to be very unpolite and cut people off, and I'm already apologizing for that. So please.
Is it the, yeah. I'm just going to set my own 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes and 99 seconds, so I can stick to that. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be invited again here, and in particular to talk about our project with WILPF. First of all, I must emphasize that I talked a lot about the online consultation, and this is perhaps the highlight that I mentioned. But the whole research, it was like a proper research where we had, for instance, Vanessa Farr as an expert that was guiding us throughout the process, doing the analysis, etc. It consisted also from interviews, focus groups, identified certain cities where we went to and we met women there and asked them about their perspective. But however, the reason I'm talking about the online consultation and highlighting that in particular, because that was the first time we did it ourselves. We did research before and studies before, but this was like really the first time we decided to do something new. And again, as I said, it was really based on a suggestion from the young activists with us in the organization who joined us, and that was more or less their first time joining a women's rights organization. And one of the things they said that, okay, you can do this research, you can do the focus groups, the interviews, but you will still reach out to certain women. How about we try to expand our research and our outreach and reach out to more? So they were actually the ones who suggested to do this online consultation. And then when we started thinking of, okay, we're talking about online consultation and using the internet, how is it going to look like? And then again, they said, well, one of the main obstacles for them as activists in the women's rights movement in itself is the language. They feel that the language that is used is very complicated. It's not a language that all women in all local contexts might understand. And then they suggested that, well, peace and security is very relevant to everyone who's living in Libya. So why don't we do something that is very understandable? In the same time, it doesn't really need to be something more or less bringing a bad atmosphere to them. So it was more or less a constructive of different questions. Some questions were written questions, other questions were MCQ questions. So it was really an online quiz that women can just take. If I would give, so let me just, it looks like I ruined the whole thing. So as I mentioned, the responses that we got in less than 3 days was more than 1,000 women, as you see the responses there. And basically what we did, we used Facebook and social media to advertise for the quiz. And we had, from these 1,000 women, we had women from different cities, basically 31 different cities in Libya. Some of the cities are really small cities, some are villages. And then, if I would give an example of one of the MCQ questions. So we asked, if you were in a public place as a woman, and you want this place to be secured, how do you want it to be secured? Do you want to have armed men in this place? If yes, how many do you want? And then, just briefly, the percentages. 34% of the women said we don't want armed men at all, because basically they are the problem in itself. And then 23% said we prefer to have 1 to 2 armed men in the place. And then this was the surprise for us. 42% said that they would feel secured if there was at least 5 armed men in the place. And that took us completely outside of our comfort zone, because in the interviews with the activists and in the interviews in the focus groups, many women were saying the main problem is arms and we need disarmament. And then suddenly we were surprised by this other complete different perspective where women were saying, well, arms can actually be a secure thing for us. It can show a symbol of security for us. And that's basically why I keep saying we need the different perspectives, because the different perspectives are there. The different perspectives are in the society. And if there is any sense that there is a perspective that thinks that armed men are a symbol of security, then there is a problem there. And then there where we need to work when it comes to raising awareness, when it comes to also advocacy. In terms of the limitations and potential, I'm out of 5 minutes.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, perfect. I must say the potentials was basically that the outreach, the age groups, it was a varied of age groups. The third thing is that many women actually, when we said, give us a comments on this at the end of the survey, they said, we are saying this because we are living this, and this is a safe place where we can freely say it, you know? It's an online quiz where you can really be honest, and then we don't need your name, we don't need to know where you live, we don't need to know from which city you are or who are you affiliated with. The limitations, though, it was basically one thing. It was actually critiques from other women's rights organizations, where all what they saw the online quiz, and then they thought that this is not really a proper way to do a research. And we were saying, yes, we are not calling this a research. This is more or less a way for us to get the different perspectives, a way for us to really understand what women on ground are saying. Perhaps those women are not even in our environment, ourselves as an organization. But then the second thing is that we managed to create an online debate. So we asked women to share personal stories, and then we illustrated them in drawings, and we shared them the same way women shared them. And then if you see here, like this story, for example, more than 3,000 people have commented on it. And then you see the comments. It was really basically Libyan people, men and women, talking about women, peace, and security. Some comments were really great. Other comments were really horrible. Some comments were saying the problem are women and women should stay inside. And then what I think was really good about this platform where Libyans can really debate about women, peace, and security, it was basically that it was a debate between the people themselves. So it wasn't us, an organization, doing a raising awareness campaign saying that this and this and this and that. But it was basically that people just talked together, and then they really managed to create this debate on women, peace, and security.
Thank you very much, Haji. Am I on? Thank you very much for that, Haji. I think it's a beautiful example of creating kind of a public space or a space for public opinion to assert itself, and so in a sense an element of a polity also. But I would like to move it right on to Rosa. Rosa, the Colombia peace process has been almost praised for being this model to follow, right? So there was a lot of participation. Women were involved in it. Now, looking at the process, what have women and feminists actually been able to accomplish through that participation? So, they were on the table, at the table, and do you think it is a model that should be followed in other places as well?
Thank you so much. First, I will take a minute to thank WILPF for this invitation, and especially my colleague in Colombia, that I think WILPF has a very special work, and we have very good partners working together. So a special thankful for Catherine Ronderos, that she is here, and she is the actual program director of WILPF in Colombia, and that is very important. What I want to say and to answer is, yes, we as women, we had I don't know, we knew that we need to have in this specific process of agreements between las FARC and the national government, an opportunity, a window of opportunity to move forward our rights. And we did a good work. What are the lessons, main lessons? We had an agenda as soon as we knew that the agreement was going to begin, the discussions were going to begin, we gathered together in something that we call the Women's Summit, and we gather women from all over the regions, because we know that peace is not only a political national issue, it is a very local and daily life issue for people and for women especially. So we gathered, and then we had our own agenda. We knew that we needed to have our own agenda, so we have something to speak from and to the agreements and to the negotiation table in La Habana. So this was a first step that I think was very good. The second is that we were working all the time, during 4 years, giving documents to each one of the points, and we knew that this agreement was focused in some special issues. They are not going to talk about everything. It was a negotiation between las FARC and the government. It was not a negotiation between all the people in Colombia and the national government and las FARC. So we knew that it has those dimensions. We didn't want to include things that were not going to be discussed. What are the main things that were not discussed? The economical model, that was not on the table, and the security model, that was not in the table. Although we were talking about security issues, but the government was not in a disposition to talk about changing the paradigms of security or changing the focus of the national armed forces towards another kind of security. And here it's important to say that Colombia is in a post-agreement country, is not a post-conflict country. And that I want to make it very clear, because we have still one guerrilla that's still in the country, and it's called the ELN, and we are trying to impulse negotiations with the ELN, and we have an incredible rise and again of what we call new paramilitaries, or different expressions of different kinds of mercenary forces, political forces that are against the peace agreement. So now we think that we are now very challenged in what we gain in the agreements. These agreements are, in each one of the 5 points, main points that the agreement has, in rural transformation, in ex-combatants and leaving the arms, in political participation, in drugs and illegal cultivation of crops and so on. So we have, in each point, we have women's issues, and we have gained that. But now we have so much challenges, and not challenges, but dilemmas, because there is a difference between a challenge and a dilemma. I think that we have lots of dilemmas about what we are expecting of this country, what we want to be changed in this country. And I really think that we have to change many paradigms so we can really see another kind of peace, because now people are not expecting peace like more of the same. We are expecting a peace that really can mean a change for the political, cultural, economical. There are lots of expectations, and what we feel is, in that sense, that peace is not longer the silence of arms. peace is really changing environment, changing the way people behave, changing and redefining concepts like solidarity, like rights. The dynamic of a peace process is now very highly questioned because we are not longer, we don't find, and as women, we don't find enough not to have people killing each other. That is very important, but we want people living in another way. That is substantial for peace. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I would move it on right away to Nela. So the Colombian peace process is celebrated for the extent to which it has included women. Bosnia probably has the distinction of being known for the opposite, almost total absence of women and feminist ideas in the Dayton agreements and its implementation. In your estimation, what effects has this exclusion of women in a gender perspective had on the lives of women in Bosnia and also on the sustainability of peace?
Yes, thank you. Well, yes, I think the absolute, not almost, but the actual absolute absence of Bosnian women's voices and experiences. And I would also like to add any other voices that were outside of the militarized ethno-national narrative is a quite well-established fact by now. And I think we within WILPF's initiative in Bosnia have extensively explored the consequences on the lives of women, but also on the society in general. And I think this passage of 20 years plus in Bosnia does really give us a lot of evidence as to the consequences of this absolute exclusion, both, when we look at the justice, when we look at the economic and social rights, when we look at the power dynamics, the distribution of resources, ownership of resources as well, when we look at the continuous militarization of the society, and ultimately, of course, the creation of the peace itself. And I think when we look at the Bosnian so-called peace from a feminist perspective, that certainly is not a gender-just peace, but from a general Bosnian citizen perspective, it's actually not peace at all, so we just call it peace. What I think is absolutely obvious is the lack of recognition of women's experiences and voices, the importance of bringing them into the conversation, was actually not a typical failure of that time, being that 1325 was adopted several years later. This was something that we continuously see taking place in the processes that are occurring in Bosnia today. So in 95, women were, yes, reduced to victims, but today they are reduced also to completely passive spectators of political, economic, and social reformations. And again, we just have to be fair here and say it's not just about how women continue to be excluded, but also how we continue to exclude everybody that is outside of the narrative that only men with guns and armies behind them matter. So there are men that do not fit into the militarized ethno-national narratives who are also excluded. What I also think is absolutely striking is at that time, and I think even so today, there seems to be this understanding that how and when you deal with inequalities in society, including gender inequalities, and how and when you deal with the effects of the war, actually has no consequences for peace. And it's absolutely mind-blowing to see that everything that has been done with respect to the Bosnian peace has sort of followed this logic. So, nothing is seen as interlinked, and everything can be addressed separately. So our lives, our peace has been completely compartmentalized, and processes have been initiated according to this, to a very problematic sequencing, and I'm going to try to kind of technically walk you through how that looks. So first, we signed a peace agreement, right? And when they conceptualize the peace within that peace agreement, they actually do not discuss reparations. So when that can be dealt with later, according to them, guess what? 20 years later, we still haven't dealt with that question. So then we move on to dealing with, having free and fair elections, but we do not deal with the ethno-national political elite and discourses that actually led to war. And then when we hold these elections, we tell the Bosnian citizens, well, you now voted in those free and fair elections, so now we have legitimized the peace agreement, and now you're participating, so right? So then we move on to try to fix the constitution, which is part of our peace agreement. So when those constitutional changes fail throughout different processes, then the decision is made to turn to the economics, and then we forget the constitution that actually entrenches the powers of the ethno-national elite, then is corrupting the economy that we now are trying to fix, right? We do not deal with gender inequalities within the peace process and inequalities in general, because that will be handled by the free market, and also more importantly by the donor-funded projects. So what we have now is, for example, you can have a donor country that within its gender equality umbrella funds projects for women's reproductive health, but you also have the same donor country financially and politically supporting a health sector reform under which all maternity clinics are being closed, and they don't see any connection between the two. So yes, so when we want to increase, the number of women in politics, we start counting physically the percentage of women in politics, but we do not consider the patriarchal structures and the ethno-national framework within which we then expect these women that we have empowered to make the changes. So, And I have to address also economic empowerment, because it was also very much present in the previous panel. When we economically empower women, yes, in Bosnia we do so also by knitting projects. We knit all the time. There is a huge market apparently, or even through microcredits or financial support to starting up small businesses that are supposed to be competitive on this new free market, but we do not address women's overall access to resources and decision making. So and on and on and on it goes, So also what I have to say is that this approach, this exclusion of women actually has had meant that serious efforts have actually been put into strengthening civil society. We have to acknowledge that, but not in a way to create independent, critical voices, watchdogs, and partners in these social and political economic transformation, but rather in an attempt to create the capacities among them to step in domains that should actually be responsibility of the state, such as healthcare provision. So effectively, for example, when it comes to healthcare services, specifically in relation to psychosocial support to civilian victims of war, this has, through a weird back door, been outsourced to NGOs, and in particular women's NGOs that do this. So what happens is that you at the end have a civil society that is dragged into the service provision, and it loses the space to political engagement, to engage politically in important transformations. And just the last point, because I think this is the most serious outcome of this exclusion, is that women's organizations and feminists, but also a broader group of peacemakers, I guess, peace builders, have really lost this space for solidarity. And we have talked about, we've been mentioning solidarity throughout. So basically what it means is that we now understand that gender equality, social justice is an individual right, something that's in individual benefits as opposed to a collective right. We've lost that space to understand that we are actually fighting for our collective right, not me to be empowered as a woman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nela. Carol, can you step back on this a little bit? So we have in this women, peace and security discourse now the demands that participation is not equal to participation but needs to be meaningful. If you reflect on that term, what would a meaningful participation consist of? Do you see that on display here, or how would you think about that?
Is this on? Can you hear? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I think that my co-panelists, one thing that they are immediately demonstrating is that what meaningful participation is very context-specific for a start, and that it would be really interesting to take everybody in the room who's coming from a different conflict-affected situation and ask, really, what would meaningful participation be for you? I think that one of the things that's striking to me is that because women have been consistently excluded over and over and over again, in a certain sense, it has become too easy to say participation is inclusion. right? And in a certain way that, that's what we end up doing is we have to get into this process, we have to get into this table. And I think that it would really be worth having a conversation about what is participation if it's not inclusion, if it's not just access, if it's not just being there. Do we mean just being there, or do we mean being heard and having an impact? Do we actually mean having power in these situations? And so how does participation translate into power? And we could talk, and of course in peace processes, what usually gets you power? It's having men behind you with guns who you can say, stop fighting or not. And it's also being taken seriously as a player, which by definition is male, right? So the sort of patriarchal assumptions about women's irrelevance and inadequacy also really work against our having power in these situations. So I think it would be great to open up that conversation about how participation really is about power and how do we get it. And I think that the international community can actually play a very different role in that than saying, like just have a woman at the table. A second thing about participation that I think is crucial is that we have to talk about when. When do we want to participate? So often we're talking about, at the last minute somebody in the international community says, oh yes, you need a woman at the table, but we all know no matter what the table is, that 95% of the decisions have been made before the table ever exists. And it's, the years of informal negotiations before those processes that we have to be part of from the start. Third point is where. And I think where is it, if we're talking about building sustainable peace, where do we need to be participating? Yes, we need to be in peace negotiations because they're about more than stopping, they should be about more than stopping the armed conflict, but they are also where you lay down the groundwork for the future society, although maybe you decide to keep a lot of things off the table in that process, which I'll get to in a minute. So you need to be in peace processes, you need to be in political governance, but I think most critically, what it is that will determine the structure of the society and the structure of gendered and other inequalities is not just in the national political processes. It's in the international economic processes that are being negotiated at the same time outside of those rooms, in a different set of rooms, right, in a less transparent set of processes that we are not part of at all. And so the where, I think, has to very much be in economic processes when the IMF is coming in 2 years before the negotiation and saying, oh, what's going to have to happen next year to get the society integrated in the global market? Those are the places where we need to be participating from the beginning. And so, when ideas about land acquisition laws, land accession laws, natural resource exploitation, infrastructure rebuilding, all of those places are the places that will have huge effects on, the structural inequalities that were underlying the conflict in the first place. And so we have to be in those places. We have to be prepared with the gendered analysis of how those things are taking place, their impacts, and what we need to do differently. The last thing I'll say about meaningful participation is that when we think about participation, and I think this is, again, amply demonstrated by things that our colleagues on this panel and others have said, we're talking about participating in institutions which are already masculinized, patriarchal, which have within them a set of assumptions about what's important to deal with and what's not, who should have a say and who shouldn't, whose voice is relevant to building peace or security and whose isn't, what topics are serious and what topics aren't, which ones can be put off until 20 years later or never, thank you, or should be determined by the market rather than the state. All of those assumptions are built into these institutions. And to participate, it means to participate within that set of limitations and definitions. And what is it that we need to do so we have to certainly be clear that that means there will always be things that are off the table, whether it's paradigms of security, right? And then what is it that we have to create to participate in, or how do we transform those institutions so that our participation, again, is meaningful and can have the kinds of impacts that we're really interested in?
Thanks a lot for this, Carol. Hajé, now that you have listened to all of these people who are kind of post whatever, right? Let's leave it open. If you had access to the negotiating table in Libya today, if you think about the political settlement that is needed in Libya today, and then think about your position as a young woman, not only a young woman, but a young feminist probably, right? It's probably not a wrong characterization. What do you think that would actually have to happen at that negotiating table, and what needs to be created to make it possible for young women to be able to participate in a meaningful way in a future Libyan state?
Well, I must say, I think this will make me perhaps the less popular person in this room. But maybe I can answer the question from the broader perspective of the participation of young women in women, peace and security, or in women's rights generally. There is a very great book by Robert Chambers, Rural Development, where he said something that I see it happening on ground. He said, putting the last first is not the difficult thing, but putting the first last is the most difficult thing to be done. And I think this is what's really happening. Before I really go into depth into that, I must really emphasize something that, maybe a confession, I consider myself a double agent because I'm part of the women's rights movement, the women, peace and security movement. This is how I started with 1325. But I'm also part of the youth, peace and security movement, where we have a resolution similar to 1325. It's called 2250 on youth, peace and security. And since I started my activism in 2011, when I was 19, from the beginning, I was really hardcore, or like I was known, the women's rights activist, young person. And it really struck me that many of my friends, colleagues, my fellow young women, were saying, no, we are not convinced with women's rights. We don't want to take part of the women's rights movement. However, they are activists themselves in what they call the youth movement. So they are young women, and yet they want to separate themselves from the women's rights movement. And then for me, that always sounded ironic, because once you are a young woman and an activist, then you are advocating for women's rights. Then you are part of the women's rights movement, whether it was on political participation, economic empowerment, or youth, or peace and security. I think the main obstacle, if I would put it in very simple words, is that the women's rights movement is very established. It has been there for so long. So for order for young women to join the movement, it's very difficult to join it as leaders, because there is women there who are well established. There are so many mechanisms that are well established there. And it just feels that if you're going to join this platform, then you either need to be on the same level, or more or less you can't follow up the conversation, you can't follow up the discussion. But then when it comes to them joining the youth, peace and security movement, because the articulation of the youth, peace and security movement, it's quite new. So therefore, young women find a place of leadership. Young women can see themselves that they are actually contributing to leading the process in itself. Since day one, when I joined here, the first thing I said when I was asked, what is the one thing you don't want to see in 10 years? And I said, I don't want to see the gap between young women activists and, I'm going to be very politically correct, I won't say older women, I will say established women. But in the same time, we should also be very clear about what age category we're talking about. In the youth, peace and security movement, when we say young person, we're actually talking about a limit age until 29. And basically, that doesn't mean women who are more than 29 are old. You are all still young in heart, I know that. But let us be honest. I started my activism when I was 19. And then the other day, my youngest sister, she's 13, Susie, she asked me, for how long are you planning to do this? And I said several years. And then she said, yeah, but you know that you're going to get old. Because she keeps hearing me the whole time saying we need young women, and she automatically thought that, you know, you're going to get old yourself. And that's absolutely true, but I was very happy to see that my 13-year-old sister see herself as someone who can be a leader, you know, not just an intern, not just someone who can do research, but actually someone who can sit on this table with women who are well established, and really talk from the same level of experience. So again, when I personally say we need young women, and I think when also the other young women say we need to be included as partners, an inclusion of an age category, it's not in return a call for an exclusion of another age category. We're not saying we are coming in, you are out, we're just saying let's share the space. Because in another platform, which is the Youth, Peace and Security, I feel so sad to see young women who are really qualified and still they don't find their place in the women, peace and security movement, even though that at the end of the day, they are women. So a very honest, frank message and a pledge for all of you and even for anyone here. When we say we want young women to be included, we're not saying, again, it's your time is out. We're just saying that we need to be partners in this together because, again, young women are active. And we don't want to reach to a point where we start this blaming and shaming. You know, the all-male panel? In the young women perspective, we also have the old women panel. Yeah, that's, I dropped my mic.
Right. Thank you very much, Haji. I'm glad you said all of this. And strangely enough, it actually leads me directly into the question for Rosa. Because I actually want to ask you about intersectionality. You have worked a lot in your work on peace education. You focus strongly on that. You talk about recognizing and accepting difference. And in Colombia, certainly difference doesn't just include gender, but it also includes ethnicity, indigeneity, and things of that nature. So given this, where do you think that organizations such as the one you are working for need to place their emphasis in order for the Colombian peace to become sustainable?
Wow. Well,
In 5 minutes or less.
In 5 minutes,
Right.
yeah. Well, first I am really tempted to talk a little bit about inclusion and meaningful participation, because that leads us to the question you just said. In Colombia, we are sometimes a little bit tired of participating, especially because our participation is not meaningful. We participate and participate and participate, and we are exhausted of participation. And when we try to see what is the outcome of this participation, it's so little, and then you need to continue participating. What we say, you cannot even go to the bathroom, because when you are not there participating, your issue will go out of the document. So it's quite exhausting. I mean, and we are really questioning ourselves very much about qualifying, or what does participation, meaningful, transformative participation, means for everyone. The second thing I would like to say is that, of course, Colombia is a very diverse country. We have many different ethnic and cultural and age and everything. And I think one of the most interesting perspectives of feminism is trying to change power relations. and trying to change or really working for changing these power relations and changing the way power relations are done between people. So this is one of the works we have been doing. We have been gathered together very different women from different environments, from different perspectives, and we are trying to work together. But that is not easy, and in the country is not easy, because women have different perspectives, different interests, different political backgrounds, and we can be as transformative as conservative. We have some examples in our country of women that can be so extremely conservative, because when you are in a peace process, you are all the time thinking, what is good for getting peace? And sometimes there is this dilemma, tension, and different ways of perspective about for getting and gaining peace. Then you have to have authority, order. You need to go back to the shape we had before. We need to rebuild families. And we have this incredible, in the referendum, as you know, we have this incredible discussion about gender ideology. And many women were just impulsing this gender ideology and trying to say what we need to do is to go back to our families and be correct, and the war and violence is because we are not at home. But also, and that is young women, middle-aged women, old women. It's not the fact only that you are a woman, and you all know that. But what is very also incredible is that in this dynamic of peace, of peace building, we have the opportunity to discuss things we never discussed before. To have the environment to discuss things that usually you will say, but you will not say them publicly. Mm-hmm. So you can see reality in a very transparent way with all their interests. So now I think we are in a moment we are making wider the us and make it more narrow the them, because there is a lot of people that are trying to bring their own agenda. So in this intersection and in these different cultures, I have to finish. Yeah. There is a moment that we are living where people are bringing their own agenda. So women are bringing the Afro-descendant women's agenda, young people are bringing the young women's agenda, the indigenous women are bringing the indigenous agenda. Now we have to move somehow in an intersectional, real agenda that will talk about all of us, not only of us as a part of that big intersectional agenda. But that means, and I'm just going to finish with this means also another time to redefine what does it mean for Colombia to have a pluri-ethnical and cultural multiplicity of opportunities, and to have another kind of state that is not a mono-ethnic and a mono-gender and a mono-men state as we have now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosa. I just got a note that I should open up the floor, and I see all kinds of people itching, but I'm also unhappy that we haven't addressed the class issue yet. So, Nela, I was looking for you to do this a little bit, because in Bosnia in particular, we're basically talking about the establishment of a liberal peace, right, with the kind of agenda that comes from that, the liberal market agenda and so on. Can you just give us a few hints, just to put into the room from your analysis, what are the shortcomings of that approach? And we are pushing for time, so the faster you can be, the better.
Yes, so, okay, so shortcomings are many, obviously, but to narrow it down to very few minutes, I think because Bosnian peace indeed is very firmly grounded in the understanding of liberal peace and the neoliberal approaches to post-conflict recovery and reconstruction, and there are a lot of shortcomings to that approach, but I wanna stick to one which has really recently kind of got my attention more than I thought was present. Basically, I think what we see in Bosnia is when we create the peace through the free market, somewhere along the line, or probably very early on, the fact that Bosnia is a country coming out of war has been completely forgotten. So in this, need to liberalize everything, literally when we talk to the international community, when we look to their policies, it's not that they have a weak conflict analysis, it's completely absent. It's not there. Basically, so the foundations of the Bosnian peace, of the so-called peace, is not then, the foundations of it are not a proper understanding of what happened in the country and how we need to address those things, including through economic reforms. It's not sustained on inclusiveness, it's not sustained on social justice and equality for all, and it's also not at all reflective of and attentive to the specific needs coming out of the war. We have a very large portion of civil population that have been directly affected by the war, and within that group, women, of course, make a substantive portion of that. That is completely unaddressed. So that peace is basically absence of militarized violence, and this is also not to say that we don't have militarization or violence as independent processes, but what we have is a very firm ceasefire, and that's direct, because there is no conflict analysis. And I think I also have to address this part, is that the status quo, basically what we have, is then sustained by the self-interest of the warlords and ethno-national political elites. This idea of the international community that austerity measures lead to progress, although I think they've proven themselves wrong many times. The idea that privatization is this magical recipe that basically cures it all, and an absolute blindness to the effects of the war. Or basically thinking that magically in 1995 these effects of the war just disappeared. And I think the very important pillar to supporting that intersection there is the willingness of the international funding institutions to turn peace and democracy, and when I say peace and democracy, I really mean in the sense of real meaningful participation, influence, and ownership of the direction the post-conflict country is going in, so that we have actually a voice into that direction, turning that into either something that they bluntly disregard by saying, we don't have time for you, literally, they sometimes say, we don't have time for your gender assessments and gender impacts or whatever you need, or you're not legitimate voices because guess what, we are dealing with your legitimately elected politicians, so they are legitimate, you are not. Or they take that meaningful participation, influence, and ownership and actually turn it into a commodity. Excellent of you that you engage in this issue. You are so welcome to engage here, but not here, and you're of course not welcome to engage if you disagree with us. That's basically the shortcomings of that approach. Very few sentences.
Okay. Terrific, Nela. I know there's a lot of questions out there, and I'm going to start taking questions now, so please, yes.
Good morning. Thank you to all for your presentations, and I have two points. The first one will be addressed to Hajar. Hajar, yeah, sorry? Yeah, I'm Fatima Outalib from Morocco, and WILPF partner for some years, for many years. Hajar, I felt since 3 days ago, when we first met, that there is, I don't know, a feeling coming from you that maybe you had some bad experiences with women of a certain age, let's say, as you named them, established women. But then I don't know if how we can, because, what matters to me and to us all is how to bridge this gap, as I told you the first time. If you are holding this discourse of labeling yourself as a young feminist, detaching from the others, who we also blamed for a long time, because the others are also part of this problem you are talking about, because they have some legitimacy, historical legitimacy, and they stick to themselves, and we blame them for that. But frankly, we are not going to achieve anything if we are trying to divide ourselves. We are already divided as women, Hajar. So please, let's be positive. And let's open our frontiers or borders or whatever, and let's work together, because this will not lead us to any benefit. The other point I would like to mention is we're talking about sustainable peace, but I haven't heard much of prevention. And I know that the lack of attention given to conflict prevention has led, and this is actually the report on 1325, the lack of attention given to conflict prevention has led to some to express concern that women peace and security agenda has become only limited to making war safe for women, to put in order in the mess which has been created by men. So I think that we have to think a little bit, and work with a global perspective and in a global dimension, which means working beforehand, before wars start, and thinking of measures, initiatives to prevent, working for mainstreaming a culture of peace in our societies. I think I'm sorry if this new generation, Hajar and others are representing here, has come, and if there is anything good about this Hirak al-Arabi or the Arab Spring, it's this new generation which has come to put order in the mess, which has come with violence, with the violent context. So just let's make sure that prevention is also an important component to sustainable peace. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And right next to you.
Is it a good evening? Yes, good evening. My name is Wafa. I'm from Palestine. I have few remarks to make. First, I should thank WILPF for having arranged this panel. And today I was talking to my Serbian friend. It's very rare that we get together as a global women's movement. I haven't been to such a gathering for so many years. We usually meet as MENA region alone. I don't see the African participants or African women with their concerns and their experiences. I don't see Latin Americans. I haven't seen Latin Americans for so many years. I haven't listened to, I was listening to you, Nela, and I was so excited. I could replace the name. Instead of saying you're coming from Bosnia, I would say this is a presentation I would do as a Palestinian. There are lots of issues in common. So thank you very much for bringing us together. I would encourage you to do this more often, because we can learn a lot from those experiences. Instead of repeating ourselves and repeating the mistakes, I would have learned a lot really from Bosnia and the so-called post-conflict and what happened there. I loved this issue of the new liberal peace, which actually is imposed on us. The second point, because this is for WILPF, this is a recommendation actually to continue the gathering. The second question is actually concerning, again, the issue that we're discussing. Feminist perspectives on sustainable peace. If I want to be a feminist and describe peace, again, I'll say a just sustainable peace. But what follows is, as feminists, do we want to participate on every table? What kind of table that we select to sit on. For instance, there are tables for peace that I wouldn't participate in, and I wouldn't put my name on. So what table, what frameworks that we're calling for in order to participate in. So it's not participation for participation. I think we have criteria and we have values that we stand for, etc. And I wish to hear from the experiences at the table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a major problem now. I have just been told I have 5 minutes, and there is about 10 people who want to talk, and Carol has prepared more remarks, so I don't know what to do. And Hajer needs to respond, and okay, so what do we do? Okay, why don't I do this? Okay, we are just going to lunch. I would like to have Carol finish this panel with the remarks that you have prepared on the question really of sustainable peace, and to some extent that is also going to get us into issues of prevention and those kinds of things. Don't frown at me. And I would encourage everybody then to go outside. Hajer, you know who to talk to, right?
I really think
Say that again?
In the evening.
We're going to have a whole 2 hours of dialogue in the evening, so we will continue many of these things still. Okay, so just make notes, right? And we'll bring all of this back in the afternoon. So Carol, please.
Yeah. I feel horrible doing this when there are so many people who clearly have things to say. I wish that the time were not constrained in this way. I guess I'll just pick up a little bit some of the, there's somebody who has their hand up. Do you want to deal with this?
Is this on the agenda?
Thank you, Elisabeth. We have a constraint with the interpretation and the room. So what Madeleine has proposed and what we have suggested is that we have a 2-hour open space we've kept from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. This has been a really rich discussion. We actually haven't even touched on your recommendations for prevention and the multilateral system. We will start that session with bringing these colleagues here and starting with an open floor discussion moderated by Madeleine and others. So that will be at 3 p.m. So we appreciate the time constraints. This has been an ambitious day and an ambitious agenda. Instead of, Carol, you doing your closing remarks now, Elisabeth, is that okay? Would that be okay with you? Is it okay with you?
Go ahead.
And you're all hungry and tired, right? A little bit. But before we break for lunch, and we come back to have this summary and dialogue from yesterday in the morning, we wanted to ask you, in the UN, a lot of talk happens, and even we've been doing a lot of talk, and WILPF is talking about inside and outside actions over the last few days. Where WILPF has chosen not to participate in the CSW, we also made a decision not to participate in the Conference on Disarmament. We have decided to participate in one forum which will be negotiating the ban on nuclear weapons this summer. I don't know if many of you know about it. Some people do. Heidi does. As we woke up this morning, there was increasing news of militarization on the Korean Peninsula. 30 women, international women, Korean women, north and south, walked across the demilitarized zone after our 100th anniversary, led by Women Across the DMZ. They have been shouting at the UN for peace in the Korean Peninsula, and they have been ignored. They have been shouting this week for negotiation to a peace in the region. We need to continue to stigmatize war, and that is why WILPF has chosen to participate in the negotiations to ban nuclear weapons, to stigmatize nuclear weapons. And surprisingly, you know you're doing something good when you're being hacked. We've had a Reaching Critical Will website for over 15 years on disarmament. 2 weeks before the negotiation, it was taken offline. you know you're doing something powerful when you're being hacked. But also, it's a space where the P5 are not participating, NATO states are not participating, but there is meaningful civil society participation. So we're seeing some equations. Today, where the UN meets on disarmament every day in Geneva, we want to do something. We're going to put it up here. We want to, before lunch, ask you to come up here in solidarity with the women across the DMZ, but also with women around the world, to lend our support to the negotiations that will happen in June and July to ban nuclear weapons. We're going to take a picture of those that want to be in it to call for an end to the nuclear age and a ban that will be legally binding. WILPF will go to the streets. I think this is what WAF has brought to the table a lot, this inside-outside, or can you do both? On June 17th, WILPF will mobilize around the world, and we're asking partners and others to take on solidarity marches to a women's-led march to ban the bomb. So today, in solidarity with those that are fighting militarism, we want to invite those that can to come up here on the stage before we break for lunch in one moment of action. So we have a break from our long days of talking. Can we do it? Yes? Yes? Loud. And thank you to the interpreters for staying over. So we're going to take a group picture up here. Come behind our, in solidarity, young, old, established, unestablished, from every region, come together.